Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we, really get into some of the biggest, most fundamental ideas in philosophy. Make them clear.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. Today, we're tackling something pretty monumental. We're looking at the architecture of knowledge, according to Immanuel Kant, specifically his concept of the a priori. It sounds technical, but it's huge.
It really is. And look, this isn't just splitting hairs over definitions. We're talking about the bedrock for how we even think about science, about reality.
Right.
And our mission today isn't just to define a priori. We want to try and solve a bit of a puzzle, an interpretive one that's been around for a while.
Which is?
How do we square the traditional way people talk about a priori, its so-called marks, with what it actually does philosophically, its function?
Okay, yeah. Because when you first hear a priori, you might just think of things that are true by definition, right? Like a bachelor is an unmarried man, stuff you don't need to check with your senses.
Exactly, analytic truths. But Kant was after something much bigger. He was wading into this huge fight back in his day.
The rationalists versus the empiricists.
That's it. You had the rationalists think Descartes saying true knowledge comes from pure reason alone. And then the empiricists Locke, Hume, saying, no, it all has to come from experience, from our senses.
And Kant steps into the middle of this.
He does, and he asks this, revolutionary question. How is synthetic a priori knowledge even possible?
Okay, let's pause there. Synthetic a priori. It sounds complicated.
It does, but the idea is key. Synthetic means the knowledge actually adds something new. It expands our understanding of the world. It's not just repeating a definition.
Okay, add something. Like science does.
Right. And a priori means it's necessary, it has to be true, and it's universal. It applies everywhere, always, independent of any particular experience.
So knowledge that tells us something new and is absolutely certain. That does sound like the Holy Grail.
It really is. It's a knowledge that's both absolutely necessary and genuinely informative. Finding out how that kind of knowledge works, that's the whole point of his big project, his critical philosophy.
Okay, so here's the challenge, the puzzle you mentioned that we found in the material. The traditional way of looking at a priori, the one Kant sort of inherited, it just focuses on those marks.
Necessity and strict universality.
Yeah.
Right?
They describe the outcome of a priori thought. But later on, especially in the 20th century, philosophers started talking about something else, the a priori's constitutive role.
Meaning its role in actually making experience possible in the first place, shaping it.
Exactly. And the criticism often leveled at Kant is that he just sort of mushed these two ideas together, that he confused the necessary truth part with the underlying function part.
He's often accused of conflating them, yeah. But, when you really dig into the texts, as we have for this, a different picture emerges. It seems more like Kant actually saw this distinction, maybe implicitly.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like he structured his whole system around two related but distinct ideas of the a priori. There's the a priori that acts as the basic framework, the foundation. Let's call that a Priori-g. The G is for ground.
Okay, a Priori-g is the foundation.
And then there's the a priori that shows up as these undeniable necessary truths. That's a Priori-k. The K is for knowledge.
Okay. So the argument we're exploring today is that for Kant, the foundational structure, the a Priori-g, is actually what explains why we have this necessary knowledge, the a priori.
Precisely. The ground explains the knowledge. It's this incredibly layered system he built, all aiming for absolute certainty.
It sounds intricate. Let's start, though, by getting clear on the terms he was working with. The historical context. Okay, let's unpack this. Before Kant really built his own system, what were the existing ideas about a priori he was reacting to or refining?
Well, historically, the idea we have now really comes into focus after Leibniz. Before that, going way back to ancient and medieval times, demonstratio a priori was simpler. It just meant proving something by starting from the cause and going to the effect.
Okay, cause to effect.
Yeah, but Leibniz kind of merged that with this other idea, knowledge that's independent of any observation. And that fusion gives us something closer to our modern idea, necessary truths known through reason alone, truths that hold just because of logic or definition.
Got it. And to really grasp what a priori means for Kant, we need to see it against its opposite, the a posteriori. What's the fundamental difference there?
Right. So a posteriori cognition or empirical cognition is knowledge that comes purely from experience, from our senses.
What we see, hear, touch.
Exactly. It tells us what is. The sky's blue today, that table is brown. But crucially, it can never tell us that something must be that way, necessarily.
So if I say the sun rose this morning.
That's a classic a posteriori statement. It happened. We observed it. But there's no logical contradiction in imagining it didn't happen. It wasn't necessary in that strict sense.
And because it relies on specific observations, its reach is limited. Right?
Absolutely. Empirical knowledge, a posteriori knowledge, only gives us what Kant called comparative universality. It's based on induction. Meaning you observe something happening repeatedly. You see swan after swan, they're all white. So you form a rule, all swans are white.
Makes sense.
But that rule is always provisional, right? It's just based on your limited sample.
Yeah.
You're always leaving open the possibility that tomorrow, boom, you see a black swan and the rule breaks. The universality is just assumed based on past experience. It's comparative, not absolute.
Okay, that contrast is key then. Contingent versus necessary. That's the gap Kant wants to bridge somehow.
That's exactly the gap. Now contrast that with the a priori. This is cognition, knowledge that is completely independent of all specific experiences, all sense impressions. And when Kant says something is absolutely pure a priori, he means there's zero sensory input mixed in at all. None.
Wow, okay. And because this a priori knowledge isn't tied to the messy, changing world of senses, it has these special characteristics, the marks.
Yes, the two infallible marks. These signal that you're dealing with genuine a priori knowledge. These are features of what we're calling a priori-k, the knowledge aspect.
Got it. What's the first one?
The first is necessity. An a priori proposition isn't just true. You think of it along with its necessity. You literally can't conceive of it being false.
Like 2 + 2 = 4.
Perfect example. It's not just true. It feels like it must be true. It's unthinkable that it could be otherwise. And if a necessary truth is also derived logically from other necessary truths, Kant calls it absolutely a priori. Mathematical axioms fit this perfectly.
So that necessity gives a priori knowledge a kind of certainty that empirical knowledge just can't have.
Exactly. It's rock solid. And that certainty is backed up by the second mark, strict universality.
Strict universality. How's that different from the comparative universality of the swan example?
It's a much stronger claim. Strict universality means there's absolutely no possibility of any exception, ever, for anyone, anywhere.
Wow. No exceptions possible at all.
None. If even one counterexample is conceivable, then the knowledge isn't strictly universal, and therefore it can't be pure a priori. Experience, by its very nature, can never give you this, because experience is always just a sample. It can't guarantee no exceptions, ever.
And the source material really emphasizes that Kant saw these two, necessity and strict universality, as completely tied together. Inseparable.
Yes, inseparably. They're the secure indications, he says, that you've escaped the contingency of the sensory world and access something pure.
Okay, so how do we find these pure a priori elements if they're not directly in experience? You mentioned an abstraction process.
Right. This is Kant's method for testing, for finding the a priori. Take a concept you get from experience, like the concept of a body.
Okay, like this desk.
Exactly. Now, mentally start stripping away everything you learned about it through your senses. Remove its color, the brownness. Remove its hardness, its weight, its temperature, its specific location right here.
Okay, taking away all the sensory stuff. What's left?
What's left, Kant argues, are the elements that must have been there beforehand, a priori, because they remain even after you've removed everything sensory. You're left with the idea of something existing in space.
Ah, okay.
You're left with the idea of it being a substance, something that has properties or depends on a substance. These underlying structures, space, substance, they persist. They had to be there before the sensory input structuring it.
That makes sense. They're the framework.
They're the framework that made the sensory input intelligible to begin with.
But wait, if we have to find these pure concepts by abstracting from our actual mental experience, which includes sensory stuff, doesn't that make them dependent on experience in some way? It sounds a bit circular.
Ah, you've hit on the exact tension that forces us to look closer. It seems contradictory, right? And that's why we absolutely have to clarify what Kant means by experience. He doesn't use the word in just one way. This is where things get really interesting and, frankly, where a lot of misunderstandings of Kant come from. If you just assume experience means one simple thing, his whole a priori idea seems to fall apart.
Okay.
But he actually uses the term experience in, well, at least 3 distinct nuanced ways. And the claim that a priori knowledge is independent of experience only works if we're crystal clear about which kind of experience we mean.
All right, let's break them down. What's the first kind, the one you mentioned the abstraction method works on?
Okay, that's notion 1, experience as cognitive consciousness. Let's call it experience C. This is the broadest possible sense. It's just everything going on in your mind, your entire mental life, moment to moment.
The whole stream of consciousness.
Exactly. It's a composite, a mixture. It includes the fixed a priori structures and all the messy, changing a posteriori sensory data coming in. Your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, the whole package.
For everyday awareness. Okay.
Now, is the a priori independent of this experience C? Absolutely not. Kant is clear. The pure a priori elements are part of this overall conscious experience. They're embedded within it.
Which is why we can find them through abstraction.
Precisely. The abstraction method is how we discover them, how we reflect and untangle the built-in structure from the specific content. If the a priori was totally separate from experience C, we'd have no way to even become aware of it, let alone analyze it. It shows the a priori is fundamentally part of our conscious functioning.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the a priori is the operating system, and experience C is the computer running all the software. You can't completely separate the OS from the fact that the computer is running.
That's a great analogy. The OS is intrinsic to the running system. Okay, so that's experience C. Now, the second meaning is more active.
What's notion 2?
Notion 2. Experience as empirical knowing. Let's call it experience K. This isn't just having sensations. This is knowing objects. It's the kind of cognition that results in empirical knowledge, like in natural science.
So doing science, understanding the world objectively.
Yes. It involves the mind actively taking that raw sensory data and structuring it, transforming it, applying rules, ordering things, relating concepts, synthesizing intuitions together in a way that follows laws.
So when a physicist figures out a law of gravity, that understanding is experience K.
Exactly. Now, is the a priori independent of this kind of experience? Again, no. In fact, the a priori is absolutely essential within experience K. It's what makes it possible.
How so?
Think about a fundamental principle for science, like causality. Every event has a cause. Science relies on that. But where does the necessity of that principle come from? Experience itself only shows us sequences. B follows A again and again. It never shows us that B must follow A.
Right, Hume's problem.
Exactly. So, Kant argues that necessity, that universality needed for scientific laws, must come from somewhere else. It comes from the a priori structure of our minds. The a priori concepts, like causality, are the very source of the certainty and objectivity that experience K requires to be called knowledge.
Wow, so the a priori isn't just about abstract truths like math. It's actually the engine that enables objective knowledge of the physical world.
That's it. Without the a priori structures actively working within experience K, natural science as a system of objective universal laws would be impossible.
So it's like the a priori is the engine, and the sensory data, the a posteriori stuff, is the fuel. You need both to get anywhere.
Perfect. You can't have a functioning car, objective knowledge, without both the engine and the fuel.
Okay, so if the a priori has to be part of experience C for us to even find it, and it has to be actively working within experience K for science to work, then the independence must apply only to the third most basic level of experience.
You've got it. That brings us to the crucial point of separation. Notion 3. Experience as sensation. Let's call it experience S.
Raw data.
Exactly. This is the pure, uncontextualized sensory input, the immediate affection of our senses by an object, the raw feeling of warmth, the basic awareness of a patch of blue, the sharp sting of pain. It corresponds to the matter of appearances before the mind has really done anything with it.
The what is felt before any processing.
Okay, this is the only kind of experience the a priori is strictly independent of. Kant needs this separation. The a priori provides the form of experience. Experience S provides the matter. If the a priori forms themselves depended on the specific content of sensations,
They wouldn't be necessary or universal anymore. They'd be contingent, just like the sensations themselves.
precisely, they lose their special status. So independence from experience S is key to preserving the purity, necessity, and universality of the a priori.
But you hinted earlier there's a nuance here. Independence doesn't mean sensation is completely irrelevant.
Correct. This is subtle but vital. Independence from experience S doesn't mean a total absence of sensation is required for the a priori to function. Sensation still plays a role. It's the trigger.
The trigger.
Yeah. Sensations are what sort of, well, kickstart the whole cognitive process. They temporally come first. Kant even says they excite the a priori forms of intuition, space, and time into action. You need some sensation to even have the thought, I think.
Ah, Okay. So sensation is needed to activate the a priori machinery, but the machinery itself, its structure, isn't derived from the sensation.
Exactly. The independence isn't from sensation altogether, but from the specific quality or the particular sequence of sensations. Whether the sensation is heat or light, red or blue, a C sharp or a B flat, that specific sensory content, experience S, is contingent and variable.
But the a priori structures.
The a priori structures, the forms like space, time, causality, they are fixed. They apply universally, regardless of which specific sensations come in. They are independent of this or that particular sequence of sensations, as Kant puts it. That's the crucial point of independence.
Okay, that clarification is huge. By specifying independence only from experience S, the raw sensory matter, Kant can maintain the a priori's purity and necessity while still allowing it to be found within our consciousness, experience C, and be the essential engine for objective knowledge, experience K.
It's the foundation stone for the whole edifice.
Okay, so understanding that nuanced independence from sensation brings us right back to the core idea you introduced, this dual notion of the a priori.
Right, a priori-g and a priori-k.
If these a priori structures are the invariant framework that applies to all possible experience, then they must be doing something more fundamental than just spitting out necessary truths, right? What is that deeper function?
That function is grounding. That's why we use a priori-g. The G is for ground. This is the bedrock, the foundation. And the necessary truth, the a priori-k knowledge, are the result, the product built on that foundation.
So the ground enables the knowledge.
Exactly. The a priori-g is a constitutive engine. It makes the knowledge possible.
Okay, let's define this a priori-g more clearly. What actually makes up this ground, this cognitive architecture?
A priori-g is basically identical to what Kant calls our invariant subjective constitution. It's the fixed, built-in mental equipment that defines how any rational, sensing being like us can experience the world. These are the innate forms and structures.
And you mentioned it covers two main areas, sensibility and understanding.
Correct. So first, in the realm of sensibility, how we receive data, we have the pure intuitions. These are space and time.
Space and time, not things we learn from experience, but structures we bring to experience.
Exactly. They are the preloaded forms. Before you perceive any specific object, the raw sensory data, the manifold of appearance, has to be organized. Space organizes everything external. Time organizes everything internal, including the sequence of external perceptions. They are the fundamental grid or coordinate system of our experience.
So it's not that I see lots of objects and then figure out the concept of space. It's that I can only see objects because space is already the framework I'm using.
You got it. Space and time are the prerequisites for perception. Then second, in the realm of the understanding how we think about and unify that data, we have the pure concepts, which Kant famously called the categories.
The categories, like substance causality.
Yes. Unity, plurality, reality, negation, substance, causality, community, possibility, necessity. There's a whole list derived from logical functions. These are the intellectual forms. They represent the mind's own active power, its spontaneity to synthesize, to connect, to unify, to bring order and relations to the dispersed data provided by intuition.
Okay, so if space and time give the raw data a where and when, the categories give it a what and how. They let us say this is a substance or this event caused that event. They impose conceptual order.
Precisely. We don't just passively receive a kaleidoscope of sensations. The categories actively structure that flow into a world of distinct objects interacting according to rules. That active structuring, that synthesis is key.
So a priori-g is this entire background system, space, time, and the categories working together, this template.
It's the whole cognitive matrix, the fixed structural template. And its primary function is to be the necessary condition for having any cognitive experience, any experience tan K at all. This function, the making possible function, is what we mean by constitutivity.
Okay, constitutivity means making possible. I think I follow the logic.
Yeah.
But hang on. If these necessary truths, the a priori-k, are ultimately grounded entirely in our subjective setup, our human a priori-g, doesn't that make physics, everything, just kind of a human-specific projection, a shared illusion?
Yeah.
How can our subjective constitution guarantee objective truth about the world?
That is the critical question, isn't it? It's the classic challenge to Kant. And his answer is ingenious, though maybe not fully satisfying to everyone later on. It hinges on universal invariance.
Universal invariance.
Yes. Kant absolutely concedes that our knowledge is limited. We only know phenomena, the world as it appears to us, structured by our a priori-g. We can't know things in themselves, noumena.
Right, the famous distinction.
But, and this is crucial. He argues that this a priori-g, this cognitive structure, is the same for all human beings. It's invariant across the species. We are all fundamentally wired the same way when it comes to the basic forms of sensing and understanding.
Ah, so because the structure is universal to humans, the knowledge derived from it is objective for humans.
Exactly. It's not absolute God's eye objectivity, but it is intersubjective objectivity. It yields necessary and universal truths for all possible human experience. And for Kant, operating within the limits of human reason, that's the highest form of objective certainty we can possibly attain or even meaningfully talk about.
Okay, so it's a kind of relational objectivity. True for us.
Precisely. So the a priori-k, the specific judgments and principles derived from this structure, are grounded in the universal invariance of the a priori-g. And now we can finally see clearly how necessity, one of the marks of a priori-k, flows directly from constitutivity, the function of a priori-g.
How did that link work? How does the structure guarantee necessity?
The line of explanation runs straight from the unchanging nature of the a priori-g structure to the necessity of the a priori-k knowledge. The clearest place Kant lays this out is actually in a section often skipped over, the postulates of empirical thinking.
The postulates, okay.
Here, Kant actually defines the modal concepts, possibility, actuality, necessity, not purely logically, but in terms of their relationship to the conditions of experience, which are set by the a priori-g.
He defines possibility and necessity using the a priori structure itself. How?
Okay, so for possibility, the first postulate says, roughly, whatever agrees with the formal conditions of experience, that is, intuitions and concepts are a priori-g, is possible.
Meaning, if something could fit into our framework of space, time, and the categories, then it's possible for us to experience it.
Exactly. If it doesn't violate the basic rules of our cognitive structure, it's a possible object of experience for us. If it does violate them, like a square circle, it's impossible for us to experience or even properly conceive. It's a transcendental definition of possibility tied to our constitution.
Wow, okay. That is radical. What about necessity?
Necessity, the third postulate, follows the same pattern. It says, that whose connection with the actual is determined in accordance with the general conditions of experience exists necessarily.
Okay, let me break that down. General conditions of experience. That's the a priori-g again, the fixed structure.
Yes.
So something is necessary if it's linked to the actual world, is dictated or guaranteed by that fixed structure.
You nailed it. Take an a priori-k principle, like the principle of substance. In all change of appearances, substance is permanent. Why is that necessary?
Because
the category of substance is a fixed, permanent part of our a priori-g toolkit. It's a rule we must apply to make sense of change over time, to synthesize experience into unified objects. The necessity of the principle comes directly from the immutable nature of the category within our cognitive constitution, a priori-g.
So the stability of the ground, a priori-g, directly produces the necessity of the knowledge, a priori-k.
That's the core insight. Kant isn't looking to God or abstract Platonic forms to guarantee necessity, like earlier rationalists. He's grounding necessity firmly in the discoverable invariant structure of the human mind itself. It's a profound shift from traditional metaphysics to epistemology to a critique of reason itself.
That's the Copernican revolution he talked about, turning philosophy inward to examine the knower.
And he hoped this would finally put metaphysics on the secure path of a science. By finding this Archimedean point, the invariant a priori-g, he could provide a stable foundation for knowledge that wouldn't be swept away by Humean skepticism or the constant flux of sensory input. This dual structure, G grounding K, is what holds the whole critical project together.
Okay, so we've seen how a priori-g, the constitutive structure, grounds the necessity of a priori-k. Now we need to look at that second mark of a priori-k, strict universality.
Yeah.
How does that connect back to the constitutive function?
Right, universality. We already established it's not just like all swans are white. It's stronger, much stronger. It's easy to misinterpret Kant's strict universality as just being about the logical form, like an all S or P statement. But that's not the main point.
What is the point then?
It's about the proposition's scope of validity. A strictly universal judgment holds true for all possible objects that could ever fall under our experience. And crucially, experience could never throw up a counterexample.
Why not?
Because the truth of the proposition doesn't depend on any specific experience or sensation. Remember, independence from experience S. Its truth is guaranteed beforehand by the a priori-g structure itself.
Okay, so just like necessity was grounded in the invariant subjective constitution.
Universality must be too. It's restricted in the same way. The universality is defined by its origin in our fixed, shared a priori-g mental setup. The principles derived from this ground-like causality apply universally because this a priori-g structure is the non-negotiable condition for anything to even appear to us as an object in the first place.
So if something is going to be an object for us, it must conform to the rules laid down by the categories.
Exactly. The categories, like causality or substance, are applied universally, open-endedly, to structure any sensory input we receive. And because the a priori-g itself is invariant and universal for all human knowers, the rules it imposes hold with strict universality within our realm of experience, the phenomenal world.
Okay, so both necessity and universality, the traditional marks, a priori-k, are really just consequences, or maybe symptoms, of the deeper function of the a priori-g.
That's a great way to put it. They are the secure indications of the signs that we're dealing with knowledge derived from the ground. But the fundamental work being done, the core function, is constitutivity.
Right. Making experience possible. Let's dig into that a bit more. If a priori-g is the cognitive OS, how exactly does it constitute experience? What does it do beyond just being there?
Well, constitutive fundamentally means being a condition that makes something possible. And Kant's a priori-g principles, acting constitutively, accomplish at least two absolutely critical things for objective knowledge, experience K, to exist.
Okay, what's the first? You mentioned mathematics earlier.
Yes. First, they make it possible for the pure, abstract, necessary truths of mathematics, which are themselves a priori-k, to actually apply to the messy world we perceive through our senses. And apply necessarily.
How does that work? Geometry, for example.
Take geometry. Why are geometric theorems like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line not just abstract truths, but truths that necessarily describe the spatial relations we actually perceive?
Because space itself isn't learned, it's built in.
Exactly, because the fundamental form of our outer perception, space, is itself a pure intuition, a core part of the a priori-g. It's the constitutive structure for spatial perception. Without that fixed structure being constitutive, geometry would just be a formal game, a set of logical rules with no guaranteed connection to the world we experience.
So the constitutivity of space, a priori-g, is what bridges the gap between abstract math, a priori-k, and the physical world we measure.
Precisely. And the second major constitutive function is perhaps even more profound. The a priori-g principles actively create the very object of empirical knowledge. They construct what Kant calls natural phenomena.
They create the object. That sounds pretty extreme.
Well, remember, experience K isn't just passively receiving sense data. It's about actively synthesizing that raw material according to the rules embedded in the a priori-g.
And this happens through that process called schematization.
That's the mechanism. Schematization is where the abstract pure concepts, the categories, are given sensible meaning by being applied to the structure of time, which is itself a pure intuition.
Could you give an example?
Sure. The abstract category of substance, the concept of something enduring that has properties, gets its empirical meaning, its schema, by being linked to the idea of permanence in time. The category of causality gets its schema by being linked to the idea of necessary sequence in time.
Ah, okay. So the categories provide the logical rules, and time provides the framework to apply them to actual changing experience.
Right. And through this schematization, these constitutive principles impose a definite order. They take the potentially chaotic manifold of sensation and structure it into an intelligible world. A world of enduring objects, substances, interacting in predictable ways, causality, in a unified space and time.
So the a priori-g isn't just a passive filter. It's actively building our experienced reality according to its own rules. It turns raw sensation into knowable objects.
Exactly. An a priori form or principle is called constitutive precisely because it makes possible all objective knowledge, both the necessary a priori-k truths and the empirical laws of science, experience K. It defines the very framework within which knowledge can occur. That function is the absolute bedrock.
Which logically brings us to the highest, most abstract level of this whole system, what Kant calls the transcendental dimension. Okay, we've got a priori-g as the fundamental and constitutive structure of the ground. And that ground's a priori-k, the necessary universal knowledge that comes from it.
All right.
So where does this term transcendental fit in? Is it just another word for constitutive or a priori-g?
It's closely related, but not exactly the same thing. Think of transcendental philosophy as the next level up. It's the meta-inquiry about this whole setup.
Meta-inquiry.
Yeah. Kant defines transcendental cognition very specifically. It's not concerned with objects themselves. That's the job of regular metaphysics or empirical science. Instead, transcendental cognition is concerned with our way of knowing objects, specifically how that way of knowing is possible a priori.
Okay, so it's not studying the world, it's studying how we study the world, focusing on the a priori parts of that process.
Exactly. It's knowledge about the conditions of possibility for our knowledge.
So if the constitutive principles, a priori-g, are the rules of the game of knowledge, then transcendental philosophy is like the referee studying the rule book itself to understand how the game works, what its limits are, and why the rules are what they are.
That's a really good way to think about it. Let's use the geometry example again. The pure intuition of space, a priori-g, makes possible the necessary truths of geometry, a priori-k. The transcendental inquiry, then, is the investigation into how that structure of space actually makes geometry possible as a synthetic a priori science, and what the limits of that geometric knowledge are, for example, that it only applies to phenomena, not things in themselves. That investigation is transcendental cognition.
And the conclusions of that investigation, the statements about how space makes geometry possible, those are transcendental principles.
Correct. Now, here's where it gets a bit loop-like. These transcendental principles, the ones describing how our cognitive structure enables knowledge, are themselves considered a priori-g principles.
Wait, they're a priori-g too. How can they be both the principles being studied and the results of the study?
Because they are statements about our fundamental invariant subjective constitution, which is the a priori-g, and how it functions to make knowledge possible. They are describing the ground from a reflective standpoint. They articulate the link between the constitutive forms, space, time, categories, and the very possibility of having experienced K, empirical knowledge, and a priori-k, necessary knowledge.
Okay. It feels very abstract. If both constitutive principles and transcendental principles refer to the same basic a priori-g structures, what's the real difference in meaning between calling something constitutive versus transcendental? Is there a practical distinction?
The distinction lies mainly in the emphasis, the perspective you're taking. They're like two different ways of characterizing the same fundamental elements of a priori-g.
Okay, explain that difference in emphasis.
Constitutivity emphasizes the job being done, the functional role. It focuses on the making possible relationship. It highlights that the a priori-g structure is the condition that enables knowledge. It's the structure viewed as active, as performing its function.
Constitutive is structure at work.
Yes. Transcendentality, on the other hand, emphasizes our knowledge about that structure playing its constitutive role. It's about the reflective understanding that these a priori-g forms are the conditions of possibility. Because these forms are innate and we can reflect on them, we can gain insight into how our own minds structure reality. That insight, that knowledge about the conditions, is transcendental.
So let me try to summarize that. A priori-g principles are the basic rules in our cognitive OS.
Right.
Constitutivity describes the effect of those rules running them make experience and knowledge possible. And transcendentality is the study of those rules, the philosophical inquiry into how they work, why they're necessary, and what boundaries they set for our knowledge.
That captures it perfectly. And this whole transcendental project for Kant ultimately points back to the absolute primacy of that a priori-g structure. As the sources point out, Kant himself said these principles are a priori not merely because they contain in themselves the grounds of other judgments, but also because they are not themselves grounded in higher and more general conditions.
They're the end of the line. The ultimate foundation. They don't rest on anything else.
They are the ungrounded ground. And Kant's driving motivation for building this immense, complex, unified system, the whole transcendental critique, was precisely this quest for an unshakable foundation. He needed that a priori-g structure to impose order everywhere on the chaos of sensation, on the laws of nature, even on metaphysics itself.
And by deliberately weaving together necessity and universality, a priori-k, with constitutivity, a priori-g, into this single tight framework.
He achieved this incredible systematic unity and philosophical security. But maybe, as critics later pointed out, it came at the cost of making it harder to differentiate these aspects when, for example, new scientific frameworks like non-Euclidean geometry or relativity came along, which seemed to challenge the specific content he put into the a priori-g.
That drive for unity versus the need for differentiation. It seems like a fundamental tension.
It is, and it's the legacy of Kant we still grapple with, that powerful unified system versus the ongoing need to question, refine, and maybe differentiate its components. #tag outro. So let's try and wrap up this pretty deep dive. We've really journeyed beyond just a simple definition of a priori. We've hopefully illuminated Kant's intricate two-layered system.
Yeah, the a priori-g, that's the basic fixed constitutive mental machinery. Space, time, the categories, the ground floor.
Right. And then there's the a priori-k, the necessary, strictly universal knowledge, the judgments and principles that are derived from and grounded in that a priori-g structure.
And we saw how crucial it was for Kant to clarify that the a priori is independent only from the specific, variable content of sensation experience S. That's what allows the underlying a priori-g structure to apply universally and necessarily to all possible experience, at least for beings like us.
Absolutely. And understanding Kant's motivation helps make sense of why he built such a complex structure. He was driven by this almost desperate need for systematic unity. He wanted that rock-solid, invariant core to fend off skepticism and ground knowledge securely against the ever-changing flow of sensation.
Right. His constitutive transcendental approach was his way of injecting that necessary order into everything sensation, nature, metaphysics.
And tying necessity K and constitutivity G so tightly together was part of that strategy for unity. It was a trade-off, you could say. He prioritized systematic integration, perhaps at the expense of the kind of conceptual separation that later thinkers felt was needed.
And, that fundamental trade-off, the pull between wanting a perfectly unified, necessary system versus needing flexibility and the ability to adapt, that's not just some dusty 18th century philosophical problem, is it?
Not at all. It feels incredibly relevant today. Think about contemporary philosophers or even scientists trying to understand the foundational principles of complex systems.
Like in physics or AI or economics.
Exactly. When people study the core organizing principles that seem to structure a field, like the fundamental assumptions in quantum mechanics, or maybe the core algorithms driving machine learning, they face a very similar Kantian dilemma.
How so?
They have to figure out which parts of this framework are truly necessary conditions, the constitutive rules of this particular game, like a priori-g, and which parts are maybe just contingent features of our current models or current understanding that might need revision later? More like a priori-k, perhaps, or even empirical.
Ah, I see. Distinguishing the truly fundamental from the potentially revisable.
It's the same struggle.
So maybe the final thought to leave you, our listener, with is this. When you're constructing your own frameworks for understanding, maybe you're designing a business strategy, maybe you're developing a scientific theory, maybe you're even just figuring out your own core values, how do you navigate that tension?
That tension between the desire for a really robust, unified system that feels secure and necessary.
And the need for adaptability, for specificity, for being able to revise the foundations when new information, new sensory input comes along and challenges the old structure.
Kant's unity offers incredible philosophical power and certainty. But often, it's the ability to adapt and revise that allows for progress and survival in a changing world. Where do you strike that balance in your own thinking?
Something to definitely mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Kant's a priori. We'll see you next time on the